The Flood, Facing the Growing Global Epidemic of Grandiosity, a lecture by Robert Moore. This presentation is part of the conference, Coping with Grandiosity in Our Lives, the Deity and the Dragon Inside Us. Recorded at the Oblate School of Theology's 2014 Summer Institute in San Antonio, Texas. This lecture is copyrighted 2014 by Dr. Robert Moore. This recording is copyrighted 2014 by IS Publications.
Good evening, everyone. And it's a real pleasure to be able to introduce Robert Moore to you. When I became president here 9 years ago, I made a private vow that sometime during my tenure here, I would have Robert Moore on this campus. So it's taken about 9 years, but we have Robert Moore on this campus. And happily, this day has come. Who is Robert Moore? And I should say Robert L. Moore, because if you go on the internet and Google, there are a lot of Robert Moores. And so you want to Google Robert L. Moore. It's interesting, since Robert is not a professional theologian who works in popular church circles, he's not as well known in church circles, but his influence on those who minister in church circles is huge. Somebody once said, and I agree with them, they said he's probably the most plagiarized author in the United States, okay? And a lot more people than Robert Moore have made a living off his work, okay? For many years, Robert was a professor of psychoanalysis, culture, and spirituality at Chicago Theological Seminary and founder of the Institute of Spirituality in Chicago. As well, during all those years, he maintained a clinical practice. Now, more recently, he's retired from a lot of the teaching, and he's devoting himself more full-time to his clinical practice. And what Robert has done and continues to do in his research and his teaching is to bring together spirituality, anthropology, psychology, history, and the study of ritual. And he brings them all together to try to form a wide vision of the human person, which I'm sure he'll share with us. But particularly the human person insofar as our struggles with sin, grace, inflation, depression, violence, greatness. He spent more than 40 years studying human energy from many, many different sources and trying to relate that to many sources, particularly to the image and likeness of God inside of us. He's deeply influenced a lot of people, including me, but other people who are doing a lot of major work, drawing a lot on his foundations, among others, Richard Rohr, who would be the first to admit that he's drawn a lot of stuff off of Robert Moore. I first heard Robert speak in San Francisco 24 years ago, and I was teaching at Seattle University at the time, and a former student of mine said, "You want to come and hear?" He said, "I want to hear a very brilliant thinker." He said, "There's an extraordinary thinker," and I went along with the student of mine, and I wasn't disappointed. But afterwards, I thought there's a lot of brilliant thinkers out there. There aren't a lot of balanced thinkers. And Robert's great strength is he brings a rare balance into all of this learning. So categories, for instance, like liberal, conservative, are completely alien to what he is about. After I had heard him speak, I had to do a 6-year term, not a prison term, but close to it, as provincial of our Oblate Order in Western Canada. And during those years, I had to drive a lot, especially visiting missions in the north. So I had hundreds of hours of driving. And at the time, I was able to get a lot of Robert's workshops and lectures and stuff from a company which he told he had never heard about. So they also made a living off him and so on. And so I listened to hundreds of hours of him. And just to end is to say, when I look at my own theological career, such that it is, if I had to name the 3 or 4 most important influences on my thought and vision for spirituality, and he's going to be an elite company here, I would name St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Henry Nouwen, and Robert Moore. And so we're honored to have him here tonight, and I want you to get all these words right, a warm, hearty, Texas. Welcome to Robert Moore. Okay.
Now, if that doesn't make me really inflated and grandiose, so you'll have to be patient with me if I get a little overstimulated, okay? Well, I want to start by congratulating all of you here in San Antonio about that joyful victory last night. I watched the goings on afterwards, the celebrations last night till late into the night. And on a serious note, I tell you, I was very touched by the way that these victorious young men carried themselves with such humility and maturity in the moment of their extreme victory. So I said to myself, now there is real manliness on the part of these people. And I was very touched by that, and you were too, I'm sure. It's a pleasure to be back in your beautiful city after so very many years. My first visit was when I was about 10 years old, and I was visiting my beloved Uncle Otha with my father. For over 30 years, my Uncle Otha managed that Woolworth 5 and dime that sat right by the Alamo for probably over 3, maybe 4 decades. Since then, still many years ago, I was privileged to lecture here several times on Jungian psychology and to be introduced or reintroduced as an adult to the beauty of this town. After Ron invited me this time, I have to share that I actually had a fantasy of reaching back in time and taking a couple of minutes to get back into my 20-year-old country rocker self. That is, the young self that I was before I had to choose either to go on the road as a musician or to go to graduate school. We all appreciate Rose Marden, and for a moment there, I imagined myself inviting you all to join me in a rousing rendition of Bob Wells and the Texas Playboys' Rose of San Antonio. But I'll spare you that tonight, bro. But given the radical seriousness of the topics we're going to be engaging together during this institute, I'll have to save that for another time, maybe when we'll have more time to hang out and relax. But I want to say a special thank you to all of you, especially to Ron Rolheiser and this Oblate community that has been built over these years of Ron's leadership. And I'm so happy to have this opportunity to speak with you about things that are closest to my heart these days, as I've gotten old enough to start doing life review. You know, you'll be hearing some of that tonight. I know that you have long been aware, as I have, of how blessed we all are by the presence among us of Ron Rolheiser, this great and good man. I am grateful to be able to call him my teacher and friend. As you know, Ron steadfastly and continually models for us through his work, but especially through his person, how to become a portal through which the Most High can pour forth fountains of blessing into our chaotic and suffering world. So, blessings on you, Ron. In late 2011, Ron had invited me here to offer lectures and a seminar. Unfortunately, at that time, a serious illness interrupted our plans and I was unable to come. I had planned to speak on 2 related topics in depth that related to what we're going to be talking about these 3 evenings. The first thing I was going to lecture on then was the Fellowship of the Dragon, the shift from hope to realization in psyche, spirit, and community. And the other topic was going to be the apocalypse of love, the shift from hopeful longing to embodied joy and selfhood, spiritual practice, and community. I will be playing some of those tunes tonight and these two following evenings. But I will be saving our celebration of all the rich, abundant life until the third lecture, because to move there too quickly would be to really be superficial and engaging what is really going on in our time. When I have taught all these many years, I have spent 40 years, as Ron said, teaching comparative philosophy, comparative religions, comparative psychotherapies. And when I have taught those seminars, I actually had about 3 hours to lecture on those. So forgive me if I start getting long-winded tonight. But I always started by offering a diagnostics. What is the problem? And then I would always try to come up with an understanding of the dynamics of the problem. And then I would end with how the particular theory or point of view understood the answers to the problem, or what can be done about the problem. So that's actually built into these three lectures. Tonight, we're going to be looking at diagnosis of our situation now. And tomorrow night, we will be working on understanding the dynamics of what is going on, the psychodynamics, the spiritual dynamics of what is going on, so that we can get a sense of just how it works. And then Wednesday night, we will be talking about what is really possible in our time, what is possible for persons of faith in our time. And I would just say to you in advance that I want you to understand that the central point of all these lectures is going to be remembering the words of that radiant one who said, "Be not anxious." So I need to say that to you because if you look at all the things going on now, and I didn't say that to you, you might have some of these things that I'm going to talk about tonight push you into despair. And I'm not in despair. We are not going there. And yet, there's some strong things that tempt us these days to go into despair. As you may or may not know, I have been attempting in the last 50 years to carry forward Carl Jung's work into mapping and understanding the structures of the collective unconscious. Now, that catalog that Ron was mentioning and that Rose was mentioning has got a lot of the resources that are available through my website on it. But for tomorrow night, I would just like to ask all of you to spend some time just looking carefully at those diagrams in there, because those diagrams are a distillation of what I have come to understand about psychology and spirituality. And so tomorrow night, I'll be taking us through that quickly and not too much in depth. I'm hoping one of these days Ron will ask me to come back and we can have more time to unpack all that. So tomorrow night, I'm going to lift up those elements, those psychological elements that will help us understand why creating an inner arc of the covenant, a psycho-spiritual inner arc of the covenant, is essential for standing against the moral, psychological, and social chaos that we are seeing today. Everything that I'm going to say to you in all of these nights will be drawing upon the paradigm, the integrated paradigm that's available and summarized in that catalog. The real overall title for these 3 evenings would be best expressed as the psychological and spiritual essentials as I have come to understand them. I want to start with a personal story of an experience that started me on this journey that's brought me here tonight. It's a story that's set in India in August of 1987. It was the time just before the global New Age celebration of the so-called harmonic convergence. As you may know or may not know, the harmonic convergence was a name given to the world's first globally synchronized meditation, which occurred on August 16th and 17th, 1987, which, according to the people like Jose Arguelles and others, was reflecting the significant prophecies in the Mayan calendar. And it was related to some European and Asian astrological traditions. This event, and I knew none of this at the time, this event had been predicted by author Tony Scherer in the book The Lord of the Dawn. According to Arguelles' interpretation of Mayan cosmology, I later found out, that date, August 1987, marked the end of 22 cycles of 52 years each, or 1,144 years in all. According to these people, those 22 cycles were divided into 13 heaven cycles, so-called heaven cycles, which began in AD 843 and ended in 1519, when the 9 hell cycles began. According to these prophecies and Jose Arguelles, these hell cycles were to come to an end 468 years later in 1987. The very beginning of the days of the 9 hell cycles was precisely the day that Cortez landed in Mexico, April 22nd, 1519. According to their interpretations, the 9 hell cycles of 52 years each ended precisely on August 16th and 17th, 1987. At the time, I had no knowledge of these apocalyptic prophecies at all. I was a 45-year-old, self-satisfied, tenured full professor. And those of you that know academics, you know what that's like. But I was a full professor, and I had a successful psychoanalytic practice. And I had, in my view, achieved all the goals that I had set myself as a 23-year-old graduate student in psychology and religion at Southern Methodist University. My wife, Margaret, and I decided we could afford to take some time off and go bumming around Asia. And so we did. And we were having a good time, but as time passed, we witnessed an increasing number of really troubling sights as we traveled through various places in Asia: Borneo, the Philippines, Taiwan, and now India. In the then Bombay, what is now called Mumbai, Margaret and I were in a taxi, and we were being driven around, being shown the sights by this taxi driver. And he pulls into this one street, and he proudly turns around and says to us, "You can have any of these people that you want, and you can do whatever you want to with them." And I thought I had misheard what he said. And I said, "Excuse me?" And then he repeated it. As we looked, there were thousands of men, women, and children standing on this street, hoping to be purchased. And apparently no one had told either these slave traders or these little vulnerable ones who were living in the hell of sexual slavery and violence. Apparently, no one had told them that the 9 hells were supposed to have come to an end that day. For a moment, it was as if someone had stuck a hot poker into my forehead. I entered what we might euphemistically call an altered state of consciousness. For many years, I'd been privileged as a professor to teach advanced seminars in the dynamics of the sacred and the dynamics of evil. And I'd given many lecture series on that topic, some of which you can see are still available on my website. But suddenly, the topic of the dynamics of evil was not academic to me anymore. It dawned on me then that the same reality I was witnessing had long been present in my Chicago and all cities in the world. I realized at that moment that I had never been awake enough to allow a conscious, existential, close encounter with the actual power of radical evil. I realized I had not been able to allow reality to penetrate what my Freudian friends have always talked about as my ego's defense mechanisms against the truth, my comfortable denial. At that time, I was experiencing a searing realization of the presence, reality, and power of aggressive, shameless evil. As a man, I was especially struck by the extent to which the engine of this horrific reality was clearly male narcissism and grandiosity. I realized that what we would call today uninitiated men, what I've called monster boys in adult bodies, were perpetrating and shamelessly propagating the largest proportion of the flood of hell energies abroad in this world. I had never intended to become a specialist in masculine psychology, but inadvertently I had stumbled upon the structural psychological reality that gives us a scientific account of the unbridled aggression and violent acting out by men, and especially men under the age of 45. So at that time, I decided that I should not wait to publish my larger integrated structural psychoanalytic theory until later, because it was clear to me that I needed to articulate and make available a comprehensive moral psychology of masculinity in a series of 5 volumes on the key archetypes of the male self. Sadly, to my chagrin, as we look at this today, if we look at it without our rose-colored glasses, we have to realize that the situation has gotten horrifically worse in the 27 years since that eye-opening experience of mine. We need to face, I think, the degraded and deteriorating state of world spirituality and how we are seeing a pan-tribal, I would call it, a pan-tribal regression in the world in which our systems, our personality systems, are experiencing more anxiety than ever before. There's a lot of scientific evidence that indicates that anxiety from the infant in the womb to all of us sitting here tonight, that the intensity and power of anxiety has gotten worse, especially in the last decade. I don't know whether you've had, as I have, the privilege of studying family systems theory and the larger theory of the great Murray Bowen. But in that wonderful tradition, and if you haven't looked at that or applied it to your own life and your own family, then I encourage you to do so. But there's this fundamental axiom that these integrative thinkers of Bowen theory have set before us. And that is that the main thing that assails persons, families, and even organizations is unregulated anxiety. So we need to understand that behind the things that are going on now is not just, it is an epidemic of grandiose acting out. But it also is manifest in an epidemic, a horrific anxiety epidemic. What do we know now from psychology and systems theory? I do a lot of work. I consider myself a systems theorist, trying to understand the way in which our personality system, our family system, our social systems, our organizational systems all interlock in a sort of a multidimensional systemic function. What we now know is that as the anxiety in any system, whether it's your personality system, what I call your system self, or in your family system, your marital system, your organizational systems, as the anxiety begins to go up, simultaneously, your capacity to regulate goes down. And what happens is a comprehensive deterioration, what we psychoanalysts would call regression. Now, what happens with that? Three things happen when you start being more anxious, or when I start being more anxious. And I've spent a lot of years frying in my own neurotic anxiety. Pray for me, I'm getting slowly better. But here's the important thing for us to be aware of tonight. You know, we're seeing all this incredible escalation in violence, escalation in sadistic abuse. We're seeing people act as if they've lost their minds, that they are out of touch with truth. We have noticed that when our anxiety gets higher, when we speak to our people we're trying to communicate with, they don't seem to be able to hear. Well, it turns out that actually is a function of our neurophysiology. When we are in a situation where our radar, and you have fabulous radar, you have radar that you don't even have a clue that you've got. But it evolved with our species. We have this incredible radar, and we scan automatically, not consciously, we scan automatically for the presence of any anxious energies. There's this thing in the brain that's called the amygdala. How many of you have heard of that? Okay, good. Because that amygdala is in the old brain. It is ancient. It is the part of the ancient brain. Some call it reptilian brain. And when you notice what I often say to people, try to be more conscious of when you put on your war face with your husband or your wife. Because the moment that amygdala in your old brain sees in the face scan any anxiety, it immediately goes, your brain and your body immediately move to high alert. And guess what? The circuits in your brain that actually enable you to listen, they shut down. They shut down. The old brain has decided it's not time to have a conversation. Not only does it shut down the capacity to listen, automatically it shuts down your forebrain. So the circuits in your frontal lobes that you need to be halfway intelligent shut down. So if you've ever thought that your husband just doesn't get it when you try to communicate, well, you're right. I tell you what, in the face of an assertive woman who might possibly be angry, men regress very quickly into their little boy. As my friend John Lee, who some of you may know, wrote in his little book that I recommend to you called Growing Yourself Back Up, in which he addresses the tendency we have in our marriages to become 3 years old at the first sign of anxiety on the other's face. So we really can't think. And the third thing is, automatically when we detect anxiety in the face of the other, whether it's a child, a spouse, a friend, an employer or employee, your complex adaptive system, the complex adaptive system, which is what I scientifically call your personality system, it immediately moves to more primitive, archaic aggression. It's totally automatic. You don't choose to act it out. I want you to think about that a minute. Now, if I'm right, and the researchers are right, that the anxiety all around us in this world has grown more and more intense, then it should not surprise us that we have a hard time understanding what's going on, and that communication seems to be shut down, and that there is so much flagrant, archaic, primitive aggression being acted out. One of the things that even in our time, even with all the progress that's been made in terms of trying to become more aware of the need to treat women with respect and empathy and tenderness and coming out of the heart, the recently published research shows that domestic violence and abuse of women is higher than it ever has been. And we need to just understand, we need to understand the dynamics of how this is working. And so, I don't know if you've gotten any more anxious lately. Maybe you've gotten to where you don't listen to the news, which might be not a bad idea. But if you just kind of look around, there are lots of things going on right now that if you are aware of them, they automatically put you into anxiety states. Tomorrow night I'm going to be talking about the way in which the various capacities for containing dragon energies in the psyche, it's what I call all this hot regressive energy, hot archetypal energy, unregulated archetypal energy. We need to understand that these vessels, these spiritual and cultural and ritual vessels that used to be a bulwark between human beings and this horrific energy have been deteriorating. I want you to take a minute and think about what you have noticed about the way in which the churches seem to be not being able to do for people what they were able to do not so very long ago. Not so very long ago. I had another memory about Texas that relates to this. When I was 23, I was privileged to be a psychotherapy intern in the big mental hospital, Terrell State Mental Hospital. And in those days, I looked around at the conditions for the patients and so forth in that big, huge state mental hospital, and I thought, well, gee, this is not a very good environment for these people. But there were some good things about it. I was doing, under the supervision of a Dr. Fisher, I was doing group psychotherapy on a maximum security ward there. And I've been thinking about all this and doing my life review of an aging man. And I wanted to call to memory George Wyatt, who was in that maximum security ward. He was this mountain of a man, about 6'7" or 6'8", 250 pounds. George was a heavyweight professional boxer in Texas. And most of the time he did great. He was a great fighter. But once in a while, he would have a little too much wild turkey or Jim Beam, and he would get rolling. And when he got really rolling, it was really hard to contain him. And I'm told that right before I got to meet him, it had taken 12 Texas Rangers to subdue him so that they could get him some meds and so on. Well, so I had this privilege. I didn't really realize how much a privilege it was at the time, but I had this privilege of witnessing this fine man, this Dr. Fisher, who could have been doing private practice in some very wealthy suburb. But he was there deploying himself for these prisoners. Fast forward. We look at our world now, those people who were having some containment and some care in Texas in 1965, they're on the streets now. They're homeless. And in Chicago, these folk try to get arrested so they can go to prison and eat, have a place to eat and sleep. I want you to just kind of get a sense of that contrast. So I'm running out of time here. I will come back tomorrow night and I'll be talking about how this has changed and why it has changed. And I'll be talking about more and more detail about the collapse of the vessel, the cultural and religious vessels that used to contain a lot of this horrific, regressive, archaic energy. In any case, when I say I want us to face the dragon, we need to face the psychodynamic and the spiritual realities that are creating the real flood. The real flood. And we need to understand that the collapse of the vessels, whether it's the difficulties of the Roman Church or the Protestant churches or whatever spiritual group, we need to understand that that collapse is serving as the fundamental engines that are fueling this global compulsivity and chaos. Personal, social, political, and cultural chaos. And now, after all these years, it's quite clear to me that it's not just males that are grandiose. Sadly, now I understand that grandiosity, unbridled, unregulated grandiosity, is an equal opportunity scourge that aggressively seeks at all times to infect both all persons and all tribes, as it was in the time of Noah, and countless times and places since then. This is the real flood. This is the ugly, as someone put it, inconvenient truth of our world at this time. It is this key fact that makes it urgent that we all work together and collaborate, cooperate in building a new spiritual ark, an inner temple, and an outer fellowship that can enable us to stand strongly and calmly against this evil tide in our world now. So tomorrow night, I'm going to speak on the structure and dynamics of dragon energy and the essentials of what we need to know to contain and channel it creatively and effectively in our time. So that's what I wanted to say to you tonight. And at this time, we're going to take a 10-minute break. Rose is going to get us to reconvene promptly in 10 minutes, and we're going to take questions and dialogue until Rose pulls me off of this stage. I want us just all call to our mind the radiant reality of the one who said, "Be not anxious." So we have, okay, just raise your hand and our people with the mics will bring you a mic. Stand, say your name, ask the question, and I'll try to offer a reflection if I have anything that I know about it.
Okay, sir. Okay. My question is concerning the growing epidemic of alcoholism and drug addiction. Now, I suppose with what you were saying, it's a reaction to anxiety, but is it just that?
Well,
I don't know, and
But everything is, he's asking, is the rise in alcoholism and other addictions, every kind of addiction, they're all getting more intense and frequent and widespread. And of course, all you know that there isn't any one-dimensional answer to any of those questions, that there is no single cause. It's a integrated, synchronistic system, multidimensional set of causes. It's always amazing to me how, when chaos constellates, it just seems to come from all directions, not just one. But I think you're really on track, because if anxiety is rising, as there's enormous evidence that it is, from the womb, everywhere, then I like to think about capacities for system regulation. Everybody has the potential to regulate dragon energy or archetypal energy or the id, as Freud would say. Everybody has the potential to do that. But there's a big difference between potential and actual capacity. So tomorrow night I'll be talking about what makes it so hard to regulate. Let's just talk about your ability to regulate our anxiety and my ability to regulate my anxiety. And I'm not a poster boy for the best way to do that. But anyway, you're absolutely right. See, alcohol, Carl Jung was the man that had the insights that led to Alcoholics Anonymous. The idea of Alcoholics Anonymous came from one of the early founders of AA visiting with Jung to try to get help. And Jung clearly knew that when you're turning to spirits to help you calm down, that's a substitute for the capital S spirit. And so, as we will be talking about more further, we turn to all sorts of things to try to calm down. But you know that I was thinking some other country songs as I was preparing to come down here. And you remember that, looking for love in all the wrong places? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. We're really looking for love. We're all the time looking for love. We're all the time looking for the love that is strong and capable of holding us to our real self. But the tragic truth is, so many as children in their family of origin, for whatever reason, the parents were unable to mediate that kind of indestructible love. So we're always looking for the big love and the big peace and the big wisdom. But we're struggling. So you're really right. Someone else. Yes, sir.
I was on a study in Louvain, and I went to Germany and to Dachau. So I had a similar experience of evil.
Oh.
And in my study, part of my doctoral work was on penance, the sacrament, the history of it, and so on. And you had to look into the problem of evil, and Richard Gula, who is one of our top sacramental theologians out in California, and he wrote in his book on faith and morality a section on evil that I could really relate to in going to Dachau. And he talked about systemic evil.
Systemic evil.
And that whole camp situation was a good example of unbridled evil.
Right.
Like I have never experienced in my life.
Right.
But as you're talking tonight, I get a sense that it's much worse, much more comprehensive, much more of a danger to our entire society.
Yes, absolutely.
That's something that came and went,
Right.
but was just a contributor to what you're talking about
Right. Thank you.
as something greater. You want to comment on that?
Yes, sir. I'm happy to. You know, our defenses try to clean up, paint up, and fix up our ability to live, do what Jung talked about. He had this idea called the regressive restoration of the persona. Now, that's fancy $500 words to talk about the way that once we get a glimpse of the reality, our defenses close up. And therefore, it's extremely difficult. If you don't have tremendous inner strength, it's very difficult to allow yourself to perceive the various holocausts that are going on now. So, yes, you're right. And I do think that, you know, all of you I know a lot about the discernment of the Spirit. I know you've studied that for years and years. Well, the same Spirit that was in Dachau is alive and well and abroad all over the world now. See? It's not a different spirit. It may have gotten more creative and more effective since then. But you're absolutely right, Father. Someone else. Yes. Okay.
And you talked about the evil in India. Mm-hmm. And we were talking outside a bit ago about how do we solve this problem? And I guess you touched on that just a little bit ago. What keeps the human psyche from addressing those issues? How do we break down those defensive mechanisms so we get out of our comfort zone and plug in?
Wonderful question.
Well, you talked about India. I saw a headline in the paper today. It said the undocumented minor children from Central and South America are chasing the American dream. Well, they're escaping evil. That's what they're doing. They're surviving. They're human. They're being trafficked as sex slaves. They're being recruited by gangs.
They're the little ones that have no advocates.
Yes.
Right. Thank you for that, Robert. Well, that's the question, isn't it? Did you all hear his question? How do we deal with this? Can we get better at punching through our denial? Yeah, it's possible. We have that potential. But here's this little problem we'll be talking about tomorrow night and Wednesday. If you punch through your denial before you have developed an inner vessel and an inner powerful ally, what I would call the great self within that you relate to consciously. If you look at the truth of what's happening without having a psycho-spiritual temple here, you'll get psychotic. Psychosis is a lot closer to all of us all the time than most therapists know. Because psychosis is a failure of regulation of archetypal energy. So we just need to know, here's the deal. Thank God for your defense mechanisms. Because if you didn't have your defense mechanisms, if there wasn't somebody in there in your ego, I'm using it in the Freudian way now, in your ego mechanism, if there wasn't somebody in there monitoring how much truth you can take without frying, we'd have a lot more psychosis. And so here's the key where we're going. Tomorrow night, I'm going to lay out more about the actual dynamics of what you're talking about. And then Wednesday night, I'm going to talk about what I believe to be a realistic possibility for you to get an inner temple that really functions, really installed, so like Jesus of Nazareth, you can look at the truth without getting psychotic. Does that compute? So we're going there because the truth is, I believe I think what we need to set our sights on is realizing our potential for high levels of spiritual realization. But notice I said potential. It's one thing to have potential for high level, what the Buddhists or the Hindus would call enlightenment. In my view, everybody that is not, and maybe even those who are brain damaged, have the potential to have a lot more living awareness. But the deal is, one has to actually build the capacity, just like building that inner pyramid, Mayan pyramid, or building what I call building the inner temple. Now, I'll be telling you what I call that scientifically. I put my scientist hat on, my psychoanalytic scientist hat on. I call that achieving optimal cohesion in your complex adaptive system. That's what spiritual enlightenment is. And that's what forming an inner temple is. But I believe that all of you are likely making every effort to move to a higher spiritual integration. You wouldn't be here if you weren't interested in that. And the truth is, we know a lot. If you look at the resources in depth psychology, Jungian psychology, systems, Bowen systems theory, comparative spirituality, there are a lot of resources to move in that direction. But it's a construction project. So, yes.
I've been wondering why people get killed for their faith beliefs.
Yeah.
You know, why? What is it that makes people so anxious that they have to kill the Christian? I don't really have a good answer on that yet. But do you think the anxiousness might come because there's so much knowledge out there that when we find out that maybe we've been thinking the wrong, or we don't feel confident in our thoughts because, well, we're not the expert in that, or, I don't know, all of the knowledge that we're able to get now, is it not a comforting thing? It's more of a anxiety-giving thing.
One of the most important truths any teacher, healer, or psychotherapist has to learn if they're going to not push people into more chaos is that people have to be given knowledge at an optimal rate. Because the rule is that if more information comes into your system than your processors can process, your system integration will degrade. It always, if you're overstimulated by too much information, even if it's right, maybe even especially if it's right, it will regress you. And so if you're working with someone, we all are, all of you are working with somebody, try to be kind and have empathy for how much their system is already struggling to make sense of things. And so, St. Paul talked about, being careful about what form of food you give somebody, right? So we got to, we need to stretch, in my international men's organization that I support, the Mankind Project, they always talk about they need to have a stretch. A person needs to have a stretch if they want to transform. But you don't want to stretch till you break. right? So you're absolutely right. We have information overload now. Technical knowledge has outrun our spiritual capacities. And all the digitalization is making us less capable of regulating. As the increase of digitalization of everything goes on, the evidence is that it is degrading the quality of interpersonal relationships. And you know what the most important effective regulator for you is? It's a loving heart connection with someone or someones. And without that heart connection, if we just go with knowledge, it's going to make us crazier. And that's what's happening. See, how are we doing on time? Okay, back here.
My question is this. Do you think that we will be able, or anyone will ever be able to change a Muslim's attitude towards Christianity? That's it.
Don't you think it's interesting how some people are really good at pulling the pin out of the hand grenade and rolling it under the door? Thank you for that explosive question. I have a few comments to make about it, and we'll be talking about this as we go on these other nights. It's a great question, but we need to broaden that question. I've been trying to get my friends who really occupy very narrow geography on the left to have more empathy for all of the misguided attempts people have to find containment and ways to regulate their anxiety. The truth is, and we can talk more about this, the truth is that people turn to fundamentalism, whether it's Buddhist fundamentalism, which I didn't know existed, but it does, Hindu fundamentalism, which wasn't supposed to exist, but it does. You know, so our idealization of these Asian traditions that are supposed to not, you know, be tribal and hostile and aggressive toward each other, you need to get over that. Because humans turn to rigid vessels after the anxiety gets up. And if you want to dwell in the love of Jesus, you need to have empathy for why people are so desperate that they turn to rigid ways to try to stay sane. Do you compute what I'm saying? So we have to love. We have to be compassionate. We have to dwell in the big compassion. And I know it's a challenge. It's a lot easier to demonize. It's a lot easier to make crazy acting out something that tribe does. But the truth is, as I said earlier, it's an equal opportunity scourge. All the tribes are subject to it. And all of us, in my Facing the Dragon book, which some of you may have seen, I talk about in there how one of the last refuges of infantile grandiosity that people can go to and still feel humble, really feel humble, is spiritual tribalism. Because I'm not grandiose. I'm just right. I want you to think about that tonight when you're home. Go home, have a drink, put your feet up, and think about that. So I know what you're talking about, and there is a thing, and you know, I like to do an archetypal analysis of every religious tradition. using my decoding of archetypal configurations. And it's quite clear that some spiritual traditions are flooded with lover energy, and they couldn't find their warrior energy with both hands. And some spiritual traditions, not just Islamic, are so flooded with warrior energy, that's what makes them so sure they need to suppress, eliminate, have a spiritual ethnic cleansing. They're Christians and Buddhists and Hindus and Jews, and it's popular way to function. But we'll be thinking about this a lot more. And, of course, any given personality, there are a lot of Islamic people who regulate very well and who seek to manifest a great deal of love. But we have to think about this. My wife, Margaret Shanahan, who's a Jungian analyst as well, she has a manuscript that I'd love for her to publish on the cultural unconscious. And in that manuscript, she examined the way in which our particular cultural location or our particular spiritual tribe influences how well we integrate. So that's another big topic we can talk about as we go. We probably need to get out of here. Is there one more question? Okay.
I know that everybody remembers the book by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning.
Man's Search for Meaning.
And my question is, we are still searching, I'm sure. And I wonder what you think of this thought, because it seems like you're saying it, that the meaning of life is to learn how to love.
You're in the right zip code.
Thanks.
I was blessed in Dallas, Texas, in 1965 to have the privilege of studying with Viktor Frankl. I had no idea. I was so way behind the ears at the time. I had no idea how fortunate I was. But he was a great man, and if you haven't read Man's Search for Meaning, he's witnessing to the importance of it. It's the truth. If, as he said, those who have a why to live, whether they're in the concentration camps or not, they can stand almost anyhow or anything. And so you see that repeatedly in the biblical witness. And we are meaning-seeking animals. And it's despair that freezes us in to giving up on our quest for a meaning to live by and live through. So you're absolutely right. I want to thank you for that, and you will have an opportunity to come back and go at that. But the will to meaning, that's what you're all about. The will to hold on to transcendent meaning. I want to thank all of you for your attention tonight and making this evening what it has been for you.
Thank you, Dr. Moore.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
This concludes The Flood, Facing the Growing Global Epidemic of Grandiosity, a lecture by Robert Moore. The first of 3 related lectures by Dr. Moore presented at the conference Coping with Grandiosity in Our Lives, the Deity and the Dragon Inside Us, recorded at the Oblate School of Theology's 2014 Summer in Understanding Our Need for a Psychospiritual Arc, a lecture by Robert Moore. This presentation is part of the conference Coping with Grandiosity in Our Lives, the Deity and the Dragon Inside Us, recorded at the Oblate School of Theology's 2014 Summer Institute in San Antonio, Texas. This lecture is copyrighted 2014 by Dr. Robert Moore. This recording is copyrighted 2014 by Is Publications.
Good evening. Welcome back. The energy in this room is just wonderful. Great to hear it. Last night, people were a little quiet, very reserved. I could hardly hear myself think at lunchtime today, and it's even greater now, so that's wonderful. I'm glad to hear that what's happening is energizing everyone and that we're learning from one another's experiences, too. So let us welcome back Dr. Robert Moore.
Well, I'm not going to tell you that if you really think about that song, you wouldn't need my lecture tomorrow night. But I appreciate your coming tonight. My plan was to so distill this material so that it was about 190 proof like white lightning. But I figured that I would not succeed. My goal is really maybe something like the best Texas vodka Tito's, which I'd like to kind of be somewhere in that zip code. And I'll just tell you, last night, you know, we had to prune a lot off of what I was going to say, and I'll just tell you just a couple of things that I would have done had I had more time. First of all, I intended to read passages from Isaiah 24, Matthew 24, and 25, because I wanted to lift up the reigning spirit of triage in our time. I don't know, how many of you know what that is? It's triage. Well, instead of inclusive caring, triage always writes off those who are really seriously close to death. And it doesn't attend to those who are going to survive. And it simply concentrates on those, all the energy on those that might make it. And but it's not, it doesn't come out of abundance. You know, it doesn't come out of abundance. And the spirit of triage, not the spirit of the royal spirit of inclusive caring, is in the air and the spirit of the age, and I will hope to be able to lay that out more for you some other time. The key thing I would just say, for you to reflect on those passages, and I meant to unfold this thought, that greed has turned Matthew 25 upside down in this world. We have been farming the sick, the medical and pharmaceutical industry farming the sick. The prison industrial complex has been farming the prisoners, and so on. But I've got to move on, because I've got a lot more to try to shoehorn in here tonight. So I want to just start off by saying, this is going to be complex and intense, even in the short time I have. And so I want us to just keep a sense of humor, because there's no way I could be able to expect you to let all this in at one time. As I said, I think I may have said in the question and answer period last night, too much information shuts us down. So I just want you to grin at me. You know, I want you to smile at me when you're feeling like your system is about to shut down because there's too much, okay? Because we need to approach all this with a sense of humor. You know, tomorrow night I'll comment a bit about the relationship between humor and spiritual enlightenment. So I appreciate your smiling and maybe laughing to keep it light, because this is heavy, okay? So I'm gonna get started here. Now this material, for those of you that have read my Facing the Dragon book, all of the stuff I'm sharing with you these 3 evenings really is material taken from us of a series of books. I haven't decided yet whether it's going to be a 3-book series or a quartet of books yet. But it's all this work that I've been working on, and it's gotten very close to being edited. That's my task in the next year. And it's Facing the Dragon was the first book in this series. Understanding the Dragon is what we're talking about tonight. And Loving the Dragon, a combination of Loving the Dragon, the Golden Dragon, and the Fellowship of the Dragon, I'm taking those I'll be talking about tomorrow night. Okay? So there's a lot of stuff that I'm trying to get in here, and so let's just keep a sense of humor. I'll take a shot at it, and then you'll have access to this stuff anyway. For those of you who haven't had a chance to look at that Facing the Dragon book, that was my attempt to give a very quick synopsis of what we have learned through the best in psychoanalysis of different schools about the role that this grandiose energy plays in the psyche. Now, as I said to you last night, you know, I've done a lot of study of comparative psychotherapeutic and theoretical systems, and if I were to be honest, I would tell you I've probably had more psychotherapy than any other living human being. And I'm proof that it doesn't always, the magic doesn't always work. But I'm not kidding you. I've been analyzed by Freudians. I have an Adlerian psychoanalytic diploma, which I got before I became a Jungian analyst. I was analyzed by Rogerians, by Gestaltists. I'm serious. It's funny. It's funny, and so on, and all of them helped me. I was better. I believe in psychotherapy. I believe it's something that we ought to actually get serious about making available to people that can't afford it, which is most folks, right? And so you need to understand, I believe in psychotherapy, and there's a lot of proof now that it really helps. Even though the drug companies are trying to convince everybody that medication alone will do it all. That's a lie. Medication is another triage. Now, everybody that needs it ought to take it. I believe in the partnership of medication and good psychotherapy, and that research shows that's the combination works best on serious problems. But let me just give you, what I'm going to do is just I'm going to make a lot of grandiose comments now. Let's just keep a sense of humor. Okay, so a lot of these therapies help. You know, Rogerian, ego psychologies, cognitive psychotherapy is real popular now. You know, helping you clean up your thinking. You know, like our folks in AA, you know what they say, stinking thinking. You know, well, AA's right about that. Well, a lot of our problems can be transformed if we just confront our stinking thinking, and what our Buddhist friends call the monkey mind. So there's no question about that. But I'm here to tell you tonight that The psychoanalytic tradition from George Grodek, Freud's teacher, who he got the concept of the it from, was the pioneer. George Grodek, G-R-O-D-D-E-C-K. He was the first predecessor of my thinking on the reality of the big it in the psyche. Freud took that from Grodek and came up with his idea of the it, the id. Freud had made a big discovery there. And that is to say, and I'm talking about classical Freudians, not psychoanalytic ego psychologist Freudians. That is, Freud knew, and on his deathbed, he reaffirmed that the most important fact in the psyche is the power of the it, the power of the big it, the id. I'm not going to go a lot into the Freud's discovery, but just to say this, in the Facing the Dragon book, I just lay out the way that Freudians, Adlerians, Jungians, and the Kohutians, the Heinz Kohut tradition, each one of those significant systems of thought pointed to the reality of a psychological phenomenon, an active psychological phenomenon in the unconscious, usually in the unconscious, sadly, usually in the usually unconscious, but that thinks it's God, acts like it thinks it's God. In Freud, it was the it, the ID, the id in Freud's therapy simply is a fancy Latin translation that is not what it was in the German. In the German, it was das Es, which means the it. The it. And so what's the key thing about the it in Freud? Well, it has voracious appetites. And it has an aggressive, invasive energy that is always trying to kick in the door of your conscious subjectivity. Now, I want you to think about that a minute. According to Freud, your anxiety, the great deal of your anxiety that comes from inside, there's anxiety that comes at us from the outer world, but it's not nearly as problematic as the pressure of the big it on the doors of your psyche. I can say a true thing here. Everybody in this room, if I put my Freud hat on, everybody in this room is continuing to be assailed from within by the pressure of this thing that thinks it's God. And that generates the vast majority of your toxic anxiety. And the whole of Freud's thinking is that your ego defenses, denial is an example. Your ego, according to Freud, it is sneaky. It will do anything to protect the conscious mind from being overwhelmed by the it. And what does that mean? And this is something that Jungians should not have jettisoned from Freud. The ego is a trickster, and part of its purpose in Freud is to lie. And why does it need to lie? It's very simple. Because if it did not lie, you would get psychotic. Remember what I was talking about last night. I mean, if you were to come to full consciousness of the power of the it, you would melt. You'd melt down. I mean that. This is accurate reading of Freud. Not Freudians today. They have thrown away his insight, and they've become ego psychologists. Part of my message tonight, I want you to have before you go away, is that I don't think any ego psychology has really worked. Not finally. Not in terms of dealing with the problem of the big thing in the psyche that's grandiose. The psychoanalytic tradition picked this thing up on its radar. And Alfred Adler, you know, there were the big three. Sigmund Freud, Alfred Adler, Carl Jung. And there were a bunch of other very gifted people in that circle, in those circles. But Alfred Adler, his fundamental premise was that behind every inferiority complex is a hidden superiority complex. In other words, if you're low in self-esteem, and Alfred Adler was doing therapy with you, he would try to, with humor, he would try to trick you into having to admit that you organize your world hierarchically, that you seek to dominate others with power. Neurosis, mental illness for Adler? It's organizing your world vertically, with your foot on somebody else's neck, and your hope that you want to be the king or queen of the mountain. That was Adler's view of psychopathology. So, what was his understanding of how you get healed? Well, you got to stop organizing your world vertically in terms of how much better you are or I am than others, and to create a community feeling. Create loving feelings toward those around you. So the key thing in Adler, though, is the superiority complex. That's the hidden unconscious claim to superiority and entitlement. So that's Alfred Adler's psychology in a nutshell. Carl Jung was the revolutionary breakthrough. Some few years ago, I was privileged to speak to the national conference of Jungian analysts in Chicago. And I chose the topic, Theory Matters, because it really matters whether or not you get that there is a big thing in your psyche. You can be a Freudian, you can be an Adlerian, you can be a Jungian, or you can be the more recent person, Heinz Kohut, and psychoanalytic self-psychology. Each one of them in their own way recognized this grandiose thing in the psyche that acts like it thinks it's God. Jung was the one who brought, I told them, the Copernican revolution in psychology, because he made much more clear than Freud had ever understood, much more clear than Adler had ever understood, that there's not one center of consciousness the ego, the I. But Jung got it that there, in the classical Jungian theory, that is, Jung and his disciple, outstanding analyst Edward Edinger, there is the archetypal self, which is the big center, the sun in the unconscious. There's a sun in the unconscious that shines all the time and never goes out. That's Jung's stand. It is radically different and much more clear than any other psychological system. And we can never go back, because of his gift of his Copernican revolution, to understand that the ego is the center of subjectivity. The I that's looking at me now, that's the ego consciousness. And Jung understood the ego as sort of the center of your subjectivity, your conscious mind. But he was very clear, and this was the first time in history, and subsequently, nobody, there's all these people that talk about being post-Jungians. I have to resist laughing at the folks that think that they now can throw out Jung, because that's a little intellectual arrogance in my view. So Jung set things straight. The ego is not the center of the psyche. The archetypal self is the central sun in the psyche, from which all of this dragon energy that I talk about in my books comes from. The reason I've chosen to call it dragon energy is because there's this real interesting tendency in us humans, and that is, if we use a concept very much, we get to the point that we trivialize it. This is true about the way people have talked about the archetypal self, Jung's archetypal self. Most Jungians now seem not to remember the radical nature of Jung's breakthrough, and they've set it aside. Many of them, many Jungian analysts, people with diplomas from well-known institutes, many of them now have turned to Melanie Klein or Freudians like that, and they seem to idealize Freudians or neo-Freudians. That's tragic. In my view, that's a theoretical regression back away from Jung's pioneering, brilliant understanding. So to make everything simple, again, smile at me and keep a sense of humor, this is the 190 proof truth. And that is that I call it the dragon because people have domesticated the word God. I'll talk about that tomorrow night. And trivialize it. It's a principle in literary criticism called sedimentation. It means that you can have a new idea, but very quickly you get bored with it. Whenever you feel boredom, sedimentation is occurring because nothing is really boring. And if you feel bored, your mind is sort of getting distracted and sedimenting. Do you follow that? Can you think about that just a minute? I want you to think about that because it happens to all of us. All of us have a tendency to get bored. that one of the things that always is a great mystery to me is how quickly people become bored with themselves. One of the problems in being a psychotherapist, this is a practical problem of being a psychotherapist. People have a hard time standing anybody really being that interested in them. I'm serious. I really mean that literally. And so, when I'm working with someone, I have to be very careful how intensely I communicate that I'm really paying attention. Why? Because there's this mechanism in our psyche. I'll give you the $500 word for it. It's a defense against the numinous. It means that whenever you get close to realizing the presence of this big solar source in your psyche, you start getting really anxious. The most toxic anxiety comes from an unconscious realization by your ego. Your ego can tell that you're getting close to knowing too much right then about the big energy in the psyche. Now think about that a minute. I don't want to rush past that. You need to really stay with me on this and try to resist the tendency to yawn. If you yawn, I get it. I totally get it because it's all overwhelming. But just keep a sense of humor with me. We defend against realizing that there's this huge thing. I like to say it's got 220,000 volts of energy. And we're trying to plug in a coffee maker. Think about that a minute. I really mean that. I really mean that. That's the way it is. Yeah, that's right. That's funny. And it is funny, and it is true. And so we spend a great deal of our psychic energy not knowing, seeking not to know. Why? I mean, is that something that you ought to give up? Absolutely not. Why? Because if you were to stop having the ability to not take that in, and if you, in other words, tomorrow night I'll talk about what is really possible in terms of really taking in the truth of that without being psychotic. But that's spirituality. The psychological understanding that Jung had was that there has to be a conscious, ongoing relationship formed between your I and the great self, what he called the archetypal self. That is the key to your individuation. If there was a way to summarize what the individuation, that is coming to the fullness of your self-realization, it is in Jung's mind, and he was and is right about this, that you got to befriend the big thing. And you got to get better at being a friend of it. If you will, let me just say, this is the key to Jungian psychology and Jungian analysis, real Jungian analysis, not post-Jungian stuff, because those people are not Jungians. But a real Jungian, classical Jungian, or even a neo-Jungian like me or Anthony Stevens, who is one of my, who I consider to be, whose work is similar to mine. Maybe better in many ways, but we are kind of in the same zip code. But Edinger was the one. Jung, in classical Jungian psychology, there's a lot of sort of cultivation of mystery about the great self. And Jung himself even had a hesitation about, he didn't think you ought to try to know too much about the great self. He was, bear with me here for a second, keeps your sense of humor. Jung was a Kantian follower of Immanuel Kant in philosophy. And anybody who is a follower of Immanuel Kant, as Jung was, has the assumption that you can't know the thing in itself. So Jung's Kantian assumptions led him to really doubt that you could come to knowing, really knowing, the big it. He believed that it was really possible, though, for you to, in your individuation process, if you're fiercely committed to it, that you could get to the point, hopefully in this lifetime, so that you could dwell in the presence of the big self. He was right about that. That's the truth. That was big, capital T truth of Jung's breakthrough. But as what happened with a lot of the classical Jungians, Maria Louise von Franz, and a number of other folks in the classical camp, they seem to have kind of gotten bored with that idea of Jung's, and they did not continue to focus on the radical centrality of that ego archetypal self-axis for self-realization. And so you can read a lot of these classical Jungian authors, and they never talk about the big it. Now, there may be many reasons why they didn't, but the fact is that many of them lost track of that. Just like the Freudians, the so-called post-Freudians, really lost track of Freud's assumption about the primacy of the it. On Freud's deathbed, he reiterated that it's all about the it. It's all about the it. And in that way, Freud and Jung are much closer than the psychological tribalists want us to believe. You know, tribalism is worse in psychology. I'm serious. It's worse in psychology than it is in religion, and it's horrific in religion. So you got to keep a sense of humor if you're studying psychology or if you're around a psychologist. Like we said last night, you know, folks really want to believe they're right. I mean, exclusively right, you know. So there again, there's where you need your sense of humor. Okay. So now, so a lot of Jungians got very bored with, apparently got bored with the concept of the big it, the great self within. I tell you, one of the ones that I love so much, and if I got you to read anybody in addition to Jung, it would be the great Edward Edinger. Especially his book, ego and archetype. Because Edinger, even though contemporary Jungians love to dismiss him as being passé, in my view, he was the one that really got what Jung was talking about and has written about it in extremely clear ways. Edinger is like a rabbi. He operates like a rabbi. He's not a systematic theoretician like I try to be. And he doesn't need to be. But a rabbi will take a text and he will stay with that text and work on it and work on it and work on it until he can try to see the sort of key essence of a text, spiritual essence. Edinger was like that with Jung's text. And so he is a master expositor of Jung's writing. So if you don't do anything else, and you just take away from me that you need to kind of snuggle up to Edward Edinger, and he'll be the gift that keeps on giving. And he will not lead you astray about this reality. Now, I want to add one thinker. Have any of you heard of Heinz Kohut? Kohut. Most of you have not. He was this brilliant person that founded what's known today as psychoanalytic self-psychology. And here was the guy in the Freudian tradition who, after Jung, later than Jung, he came back and he was the one who made the great breakthrough in understanding narcissistic pathology. In other words, Heinz Kohut. See, even classical Jungians would tend, and still do tend, not to have much empathy for people who are inflated. We tend to be a little bit judgmental of people who are inflated, especially if they're severely inflated. You know, come into your office and want to shine. You know, a person that's real narcissistically wounded will try to come in, and if you're trustworthy and they sense they can trust you, they will show you their, what Kohut called, the grandiose exhibitionistic self-organization. Now, don't run off now. Stay with me on that. Kohut, here's this guy coming out of the Freudian tradition, brilliant. He was so worshipped by the Freudians. I once went to a conference, big room, twice, 2 or 3 times as big as this, and it was full of Freudian psychoanalysts. And when Heinz Kohut walked in the room, big, tall, handsome, white-haired guy at that time, he walks in the room and he starts walking down the aisle, and you would have thought Jesus Christ had just walked in that room. The energy was amazing. I mean, they got as quiet you could hear a pin drop because they had an idealizing projection on Heinz Kohut. We Jungians would say they projected on Kohut the perfection of an idealized, what we call in psychoanalysis, an idealizing transference. You know, I gave lectures one time called Idealization and Evil, because there's a part of us, especially the little child part of us, that really needs to idealize somebody. And that child part of us needs to it needs to have somebody hold our idealization good enough, well enough, because that is the way that we seek to connect with the gold, the God reality. Think about that now. I'm not going to rush you. I want you to think about that. So, in other words, when he walked in that room, what Anne-Marie Rizzuto, one of those self-psychologists, came to call the living God, the projection of the living God, psychological God, the idealization on him. And, you know, hey, I get it. He deserved a lot of admiration because it was through his work, after Jung, that actually moved us all toward the possibility of loving someone who is suffering from a narcissistic personality disorder. If you don't know what a narcissistic personality disorder is, you Google it, because you know a lot of them. Some of you may meet them in the mirror every day. But it is a distinct, I'll show you in a little bit. How much time do we have left, Rose?
You have 15 minutes.
Okay. Hoop-de-doo. I got 15 minutes. Okay. So Kohut actually enabled us, paradoxically, to be able to appreciate Jung's revolution better, because it just underscores how radically correct Jung was to understand the importance of inflation. Kohut actually taught me, because I was very fortunate, my psychoanalyst wife, Margaret, had the privilege of studying and being supervised by Ernest Wolff, who was Heinz Kohut's right hand, and maybe the most understandable writer of that tradition. Margaret had the opportunity to study with Ernest Wolff and be supervised by him, and I learned all that I know about Kohut and his self-psychology because of Margaret. I tried to be a good student. I think I've been pretty good as a student of Kohut. And the key point there is simply we have to get to where we can have a person who's really arrogant. That's a narcissistic personality disorder. A really arrogant person, and we have to accept the challenge of not hating them. I want you to think about that. A lot of therapists hate them. A lot of therapists cannot stand being in a room with them. And the interesting thing about patients in psychotherapy, they can always tell in their gut what you really think of them. And they can always tell whether you have good intention toward them and empathy or not. A therapist can't hide it. Okay. So now I just wanted to take 2 or 3 minutes to just tell you one concept that I have created with the help of Heinz Kohut to move my point of view from being a classical Jungian to what I call a neo-Jungian. And that is the understanding that in your psyche, there are not 2 centers, but 3. There's the center, the God within, that's the archetypal self. It is all-knowing. And it is complete in itself. It's complete. It is full. It is abundant. And it is the seat of the blueprint for your individuation. And what I call the code for your psychological development resides in that archetypal self. So that's the great center. And I've said to you that, just a minute. Oh, you can't hear me? Okay. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you for reminding me. I get overstimulated, see? And so here's the deal. The second center I mentioned, it's the ego, the center of your subjective awareness. But Kohut enabled us to think about the fact that there is an actual organizational center in your psyche that's not the ego consciousness. Kohut called it the nuclear self with a little s. That means a organization in your psyche that you're not born with and actually has to be evoked, and it actually has to be nurtured. So in other words, not everyone has a nuclear self. You don't come with a nuclear self. You don't come with a little s self that is solid and workable. That has to be, the potential for that has to be evoked. It has to be blessed. And there have to be people. Stay with me now. Stay with me. I'm almost done. It has to be nurtured by relationships, loving, available, emotionally available, ongoing, nurturing relationships. Without that, without ongoing, nurturing, heart-connected, loving relationships, the little organizational self does not form. All of us have the potential to form a, what Kohut called, and what I agree, and you'll see in my diagrams, is you have the potential to form a really cohesive little s self. That we will be talking about more tomorrow night. That is the inner temple. It's in my diagrams. Now, I just want to refer to that one diagram, and then we can kick it around in our discussion period. This one here, the one that says the path of individuation toward optimal personality. It's page 8. Thank you. Now, if you carefully meditate on that diagram, your right brain will get it. Because these diagrams in this catalog are a distillation of the essence of my findings. The first 4 stages represent Edinger's work. That's Edinger's work. He understood that in the early part of life, the big task is to differentiate yourself from the dragon. That you can't stay unconsciously merged with the dragon. Stay with me on that thought now. The task in early life is to gain the insight and get the help you need to differentiate your I from the it, from the big it. Now think about that and hold that in your mind for a minute, and we're almost done for now. So You can read Edinger's Ego and Archetype for an understanding of that first 4 circles. The 5th, 6th, and 7th are my work, my movement to another understanding of what I call the system self. So there are 3 centers in your psyche. The great self, which is the archetypal self. It's the God imago in you. Always has been in you. You, as you see in those diagrams, you came out of your ego. Your ego came out of it, out of that big circle. The little dark circle is your potential differentiated I. But when you're a child, you don't know the difference between you and the it. And as you get older through adolescence and hopefully coming into adulthood, the goal is to develop what Edinger called the ego archetypal self-axis. That's a fancy word. It's not to represent, it doesn't tell you really what it is. That's the friendship, the respectful. When you get to the point when you can be clear that you are not it in a simplistic way. And gross narcissistic grandiosity and acting out is always a phenomenon and a manifestation of not getting that. So when you're really regressed into your particular form of grandiosity, we all have our favorite route to regress into our grandiosity. And it will always be a possibility. And if I had more time, which hopefully one day I will be able to teach you this stuff in more detail. But I'll guarantee you, you have a favorite way, a favorite pathway on which you regress into your grandiosity. So the goal, and this is where Edinger leaves it, the ego, archetypal self, conscious connection. Differentiation and conscious connection. But the great Erich Neumann, a brilliant Israeli Jungian analyst, whose work is fabulous. He wrote a book. He wrote many books, but he wrote this amazing book that put on your reading list. It's called The Origins and History of Consciousness. And in that book, he lays out the reality that I'm simply updating with more recent evidence and more contemporary language, that after you get differentiated, the process doesn't stop there. You need to reconnect consciously to the great self, and you need to develop carefully, respectfully, the capacity to enter into it again. And so the final stage of individuation for Edinger, and he lays it out in that Origins and History of Consciousness, is to reconnect with what Edinger thinks of as the great goddess, the archetypal mother. That is a primal classical Jungian way to say it, and it's not wrong. But I always have to remind people there's also an archetypal father that you need to learn to dwell in too. So anyway, Neumann, Origins History of Consciousness, he did not have the benefit of being able to learn from Heinz Kohut, so he never talked about the little s self, or what I call the system self in your personality. That cup, you see that? That's the psychological chalice. That cup, the formation of that cup, is the psychological Holy Grail. Because it's the psychological Holy Grail. Because if you do not form that cup of the little s self to hold all this archetypal energy consciously, then you will not be able to stand all of its power. And you will have to go away from it, or you will get really sick, really crazy. So in other words, one needs to develop this potential to have an inner vessel into an actual capacity. When I'm talking with you in these days, you have to have the capacity to contain and channel all of this God energy consciously. And if you cannot have that capacity, you won't be able to hold much God energy in your psyche without fragmenting. Let me say that again. And then I'm going to stop for now, and we'll take a break. On those last three images there in that diagram, the formation of the system self as an actual capacity in the complex adaptive system of your personality, an actual capacity, that is the actual psychological formation of the cup of transformation, imaged spiritually in the cup of the Eucharist, and imaged in myth as the Holy Grail. But it can be spoken about scientifically. Everything I'm telling you now, I can argue without referring to anything divine. I've got my psychoanalytic scientist hat on now. If you understand systems theory, you can actually lay out scientifically what I just said. So I know that's a lot, but I want us to dialogue about that. So, what is possible? We're going to talk about a lot tomorrow night. Those three diagrams at the end there, the fifth, sixth, and seventh circle, that's what you really have the potential to do. It's really possible for you to develop such a secure inner vessel that you can more and more, like Eric Neumann taught, that more and more you can take refuge in the heart of the archetypal self, the God within. Think about that a minute. It is really possible, psychologically, to get to the point where you can dwell consciously in the archetypal self and have a loving relationship with it. Tomorrow night, I'm going to take off my psychoanalytic scientist hat, and I'm going to put on my crazy crazy spiritual theologian hat. And I'm going to say the same thing to you in theological and spiritual terms, because it's two sides of the same coin. They have to be seen as this. So that's a lot to take into, but that's where we're going. So I hope you get that I'm giving you the psychological gospel, good news, because very few psychologists really think that's possible for you. But Jung knew it was. And I'm just trying to articulate it with contemporary resources. So I want to thank you very much. We're going to take a break now for 10 minutes. Thank you very much, and come back and we'll discuss.
Oh, yeah. We can go to 9 or whatever.
Take a few deep breaths. That'll help you regulate the anxiety that I just caused by pouring all this stuff into your psyche. And keep a sense of humor, because there's no way you could master that in that length of time. So I don't really expect you to have been able to do that. And yet, everything I said to you is true about my Jungian and neo-Jungian theory. And so it's all in those diagrams, and God willing, inshallah, as the Islamic people say, God willing, I might have an opportunity to go deeper into it with more adequate time. I'm a professor. I was a professor for over 40 years. And I had at least 3 hours at a time for 10 sessions, 30 hours. But now you have an opportunity. And remember, there are elaborate hundreds of hours of lectures that make this more detailed, unpack it in more detail. It's all there, available through the website. So if I have managed to stir any interest, you're not going to have any problem finding the material. And then if you'll pray for me and send me energy, because my old battery doesn't hold the charge very much these days. But if you'll pray for me and send me energy, actually this series of books may actually be in print, and then you can just curl up with a drink and read it. So anyway, I want to open it up. We have our people with mics. Rose has a mic, and I'd like you to stand up, say your name, and ask your question.
Hello, Doctor. Exactly that same thing that you're asking for, prayer, is what I was going to ask about in relationship to what you were talking about with the id and the ego, and how, in your opinion, it might have some effects.
What's it got to do with prayer? Well, in Jung's idea, there was fundamentally dream interpretation. Right. Every dream is a special delivery letter to you from the big it. Jung said the archetypal self, the dragon I call it, turns the face to you that you turn to it. So if it sends you a dream, it meant for you to pay attention to it, to respect. That's the least. We'll talk tomorrow night. The least you can do, the first thing that's the most important thing to do, is to show respect to it. Because if you don't show respect to it, it tends to turn its war face toward you. And the trickster archetype will constellate and teach you how to respect, teach you respect by having you lose your car keys or leave your Visa card somewhere that you can't remember where. Got me the other day. I went to the bank. Bank called me. Hey, we have your Visa. So I know I was a little inflated and grandiose. And that just kind of said, hey, watch it, Robert, watch it. So that dream interpretation, especially delivery letters, and Jung actually thought that active imagination dialogues were even more powerful than dreams as a resource for developing that friendship. So there's a lot of stuff out there on active imagination, and many of you are probably experts on it. You probably facilitate guided meditations and visualizations all over the place down here. I know I'm preaching to the choir. But this man has a great question, and it's one that doesn't get addressed much. You want to have a loving relationship with it, need to learn how to pray. Because, if you pray, now I keep my scientist hat on now. If you pray, you're cultivating the friendship. Psychologically speaking, you're cultivating a conscious friendship with the big it. So prayer is not often talked about by many Jungian analysts, but some talk about it a lot. I admire the great Anne Ulanov a great deal, New York City analyst. I admire a great deal, and you can look at her books. Anne Ulanov, she's got great books on women. She's got a fabulous book on envy that you all ought to read, but you have to read it slowly because it's so painful. It's called Cinderella and Her Sisters. Because, to the extent that you show your gold, people are going to envy and hate you. So, prayer. It's the rapid way to develop a conscious, loving relationship with the big it. So thank you for that. You're absolutely on target. Another?
Yes. My question is, could you expound a little bit more on the active imagination?
Active imagination?
Yes. What exactly is that?
Well, let me give you a great reference by the great Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson has been a fabulous resource for people like you for many, many, many years. For many years, Robert and I taught at the Southeastern Jungian spirituality conference called the Journey into Wholeness. I don't know whether you ever heard of that. But his book, Inner Work, it is basic, it's readable, it's understandable, and it gives you instructions. I'll put it in a nutshell. In active imagination, you actually can write for your ego, for your I, in your journal, and then you can write for the great it with your left hand. Or you can put it with your laptop. You can put your thoughts in lowercase. And then you can ask it what it has to say and then you can type what it has to say in caps. Now, if you haven't never done this, it sounds really weird. But you know, I have conducted complete analysis with people in which I really didn't do any therapy. I simply sought to open up a trusting space, and they did active imagination with the great self. It says it says a lot of things that are much more brilliant than I could ever say. So that's what active imagination is. And the good news is you can read Robert Johnson, and he gives you the ABCs in a really true way. Other questions, comments? Back here.
My question is kind of the relationship with what you're saying with things like the Myers-Briggs and Enneagrams.
Okay.
Not that I'm refuting them, but it feels like, in a way, that, okay, whatever one's type is with any of those things, that this is something that is like Prometheus bound or something. You're bound by these things and you can't escape them. And maybe you don't want to escape them. I don't know.
Can you all hear him? He's asking about Myers-Briggs typology and Enneagram reading, you know, what you are on the Enneagram. But you didn't really say your question. What is your question about that?
My question is those well, maybe it's an observation, but those things feel like one is tied in or imprisoned by something, which is my issue. Maybe
I think I see an implicit question.
Okay, good. Maybe you can tell me what it is, and I'd appreciate it.
I think what your question is do I need to camp out in my Myers-Briggs type and live there forever? Well, depends on how you understand individuation. This is parallel to those people who say, find your myth. You remember any of those? Find your myth that you're living and just live it to the fullest. Well, I think what you got to do is to become conscious about what myth you're living and let the great self liberate you from that cul-de-sac. So that's what you're implicitly asking. Am I trapped? At the fundamental level, am I trapped by my type or my Enneagram number or by my myth I'm unconsciously living? I can just tell you my opinion. You got to be liberated from those things. They are way stations on your journey. And they are worthy way stations. If I had more time to teach you, I would show you how that's also true. You know, most of us could be diagnosed with a psychopathology if somebody wanted to do it. You know, when I was young, if it moved, I diagnosed it. And I got really good. I used to teach advanced courses in advanced diagnosis. And I learned from the great Theodore Milan, who was the most scientific and the best of them. But healing is not going to come out of putting you in a label. Now, if you really trained in psychotherapy, you could diagnose me at the drop of a hat, and you'd probably be right. But here again, you got to keep a sense of humor. Because if there's a therapist that's trying to communicate to you that you are borderline, you've always been a borderline, you'll always be a borderline, and there's not really any hope for you, and there are a lot of therapists like that, get a new therapist. Because they really don't know what they're talking about. So, another back here. Somebody else. Anybody over here? I've been looking over this way. Anybody over here that's got a question? I'll take one more question tonight. And tomorrow night, I'm going to put my spiritual theologian hat on, my theologian of the ecstatic spirit hat. And I'm going to shamelessly talk about all this from the point of view of spiritual life. So I'm old, so I can be honest. Finally, okay? So that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm just going to talk about this from the spiritual perspective. But one more question, and then I'll let you folks get some rest.
This may not be the... So with regards to what you're going to speak about tomorrow night, then could you give us some insight about how we might integrate your scientific perspective that you gave us tonight with your spiritual perspective that we're going to get tomorrow night?
I intend to, but you're going to have to keep a sense of humor.
Okay. Can we wear both hats at the same time?
I'll tell you what I consider to be the end. She's asking about how I might talk to you about how the scientific frame that I just gave you relates to a spiritual view that I'm going to give you tomorrow night. There are two sides of the same coin. In my view, they're talking about the exact same truth. One, so you can't really integrate scientific psychology and, we could say existential theology and spirituality. You can't, because it's two different perspectives on the same diamond. But it's the diamond where the integration is. What the Buddhists call, and I'll talk about some tomorrow night, the diamond body, the God imago. That's where it's integrated. But you shouldn't collapse scientific psychology and spirituality, because that's very naive. Because they have different assumptions. The things I talked to you about tonight, I don't need any revelation to argue that with anybody that is interested in evidence. You see what I mean? But what I'm going to tell you about tomorrow night, to answer your question, in my view, it's all about the diamond within. So the scientific perspective I just gave you, I think is accurate. I think it draws on more scientific evidence, multiple disciplines, than any other point of view out there. But you know what? All psychological systems, you know the difference between a jet and a rocket, a jet engine and a rocket engine? Well, a jet engine has to have oxygen in the atmosphere, and it can fly only so high before it can't go any higher. That's the way psychology is. By definition, psychology can only just take you to a certain altitude. That's not a flaw. That's all it can do. By definition, it can only take you to a certain altitude of intellectual understanding. Spirituality, if it's really integrative, which it needs to be, spirituality is like a rocket engine. and it can take you out of the gravitational pull of the world that you live in. So that's how to understand it. So tonight we did the jet engine thing. We climbed up to maybe 40,000 feet, but the air's getting really thin up there. Not too much oxygen. Tomorrow night we'll gain a little more altitude than that. Okay? That's what I'm going to try to offer you. But keep a sense of humor. It's going to be just as difficult as tonight, but you don't have to master it tonight or tomorrow night. But everything I'm going to tell you, I think is true. And so, even if you just get it a bit, that's an achievement. And we'll celebrate it. So anyway, have a good night's sleep. And I will see you folks tomorrow evening.
Thank you, Dr. Moore.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
This concludes Understanding Our Need for a Psycho-Spiritual Arc, the second of 3 related lectures by Dr. Moore presented at the conference Coping with Grandiosity in Our Lives, the Deity and the Dragon Inside Us. Recorded at the Oblate School of Theology's 2014 Summer Institute in San Antonio, Texas. The Real Ark, Building the Fellowship of the Golden Dragon, a lecture by Robert Moore. This presentation is part of the conference Coping with Grandiosity in Our Lives, the Deity and the Dragon Inside Us. Recorded at the Oblate School of Theology's 2014 Summer Institute in San Antonio, Texas. This lecture is copyrighted 2014 by Dr. Robert Moore. This recording is copyrighted 2014 by IS Publications.
Well, I thank you for taking the time to be here, and I want to say again, I really appreciate your giving me this opportunity to see if I can think again. So I really appreciate your opening up this space and spending a little time with me. And if I have last night broken any circuit breakers, I apologize. Just remember to keep a good sense of humor. There's an old saying in some parts of the South where they say, whenever you're listening to me, make sure you're taking it all with a 100-pound sack of salt. In other words, I may not understand what I'm talking about tonight, but I'm going to make some offerings anyway. So tonight, I told you that I was going to take off my psychoanalytic scientist hat and that I'm going to talk about, I think, the most important thing that has brought us here together, and that is the real spiritual center that we need to be trying to ground ourselves within our lives. As you remember, I said last night, psychology is useful and helpful as far as it goes. And tonight, we want to focus on walking your spiritual path. And what I'm going to do is just share some things that have been coming to me. You know, Jung believed in the possibility of living what he called a synchronistic life. For Christians, we would say that you follow the leadings of providence as they slowly open out. And you try to pay attention to the signs that may help you discern your path. Some of you told me that you'd been studying the discernment of the spirits. Well, that's kind of where we're going to go tonight. We talked about all the psychological take on what is possible in the possible psyche. Tonight, I'd like to just share with you some reflections on what I believe is really possible for us spiritually. You know, there are a lot of folk who set their sights really low in spiritual life. But Jung sort of opened up a space for people to think about that individuation thing, which is not minimalist. You know, it's not some kind of arbitrary cutting off of where you could possibly go. And for Jung, you know, he had to be a closet mystic for many years, because if he hadn't been a closet mystic, he would have been totally dismissed as a scientist. In truth, he was always grounded in his own mystical experience. So I just want to share with you a few synchronicities that you know, you all experience synchronicities, meaningful coincidences, things that come to you that you did not invite, but that seem to bring some sort of illumination with them. Here lately, I have been really kind of fascinated to notice how many Buddhists have been showing up for me to work with. And I hadn't really had much to do with Buddhism in a long time. You know, in my younger days, I was privileged to actually teach comparative religions for quite some time. I taught Hinduism and Buddhism and Taoism and so on. But I'd been out of touch with that for a long time. I'd sort of even forgotten that back in 1992, I edited a volume on Buddhism and Jung called The Self and Liberation. And what I'd done is I had sought out and brought together all of the really good essays that we could find anywhere that were the best essays relating Jung to Buddhism. And I hadn't thought about that book probably in 20, 25 years, something like that. This Jungian analyst calls me up and he says, "Robert, I'm writing a book on the ox herding pictures that were a chapter in the book you published back in 1992. I said, "Oh, really?" So I started looking. So he asked me, "Would you talk with me about the ox herding pictures?" I said, "Well, you'll have to let me find my book and read that again. I don't remember anything about it." So what the ox herding pictures are a series of images which are sort of one of the Buddhist versions of that diagram of the path toward individuation that I was talking to you about last night. So these pictures depict the Buddhist understanding of the stages of the path toward enlightenment. So I got that out, and this was before these Tibetan Buddhists started showing up. So I looked at that thing on the ox herding pictures. If you haven't ever seen them, you ought to find an old copy of that and check them out. They're very fascinating in the light of what we're talking about tonight. Anyway, so I told him yes, after I reviewed that, I would be happy to sit down with him and talk to him about it. So as I'm trying to review what was in this book, I start getting these calls from these folks that want to do some analysis with me who happen to be Tibetan Buddhist. And I I was puzzled by that, all this, suddenly they all come up together. That's what happens in synchronicity. So as I'm trying to find out something about the world of these young people, I say young, they're in their 40s, that's really young, as you know. And so I began to ask for some resources to kind of update me a little bit on Tibetan Buddhism. And so I began to look at some of the major texts of what they call Kalachakra school of Dzogchen Tibetan Buddhism. It's sort of a Buddhist version of Catholic mysticism. It's really wild. And so I'm reading this stuff, and I'm trying to understand what these young Buddhists are talking about their experience and what their Lama tries to transmit to them. And so this is all very fascinating, and it's sort of new territory to me. And I start listening, and fascinating, they start kind of teaching me what the Lama has been teaching them. The Lama is their guru of their tradition. What starts happening to me is I start really experiencing some fascination with a lot of their insights, which I was not aware that they had on the spiritual path. Not all Buddhists are alike. The Zen Buddhists are kind of like Presbyterian Buddhists. Calvinist. Simple. No symbolism. But the Tibetan Buddhists, I found out that they sort of go in and explore the collective unconscious. I thought, this is spooky. I mean, they're doing, from their point of view, the same thing I've been trying to do from a Jungian point of view, mapping the collective unconscious. And they have been at this a long, long time. And it's quite fascinating. And as I start reading all this stuff, and in my work, if you've been familiar with my work over the last couple of decades, I talk a lot about that diamond body, that crystalline structure in the psyche that Jung actually believed was the geometry of the archetypal self. Basically, in my work, I've just kind of picked up where Jung left off, and Jung was always trying to figure out what those facets of that octahedron were. I meant to bring you a calcium fluoride crystal and left it at home. Go to a lapidary here in town, if you got one. See if they got a calcium fluoride crystal. They're a naturally occurring octahedron. And that's the shape. That's in the exact geometrical shape that Jung thought was the shape of the archetypal self. So I had called that, I named that the diamond body. And as you notice, you may see in that catalog that I finally decided that a way to symbolize what I've been working on is decoding the diamond within, the diamond body, from a psychological point of view. Turns out that the particular Tibetan tradition that these young people are studying is the tradition that speaks the most about the diamond body that's in you. And that according to them, their spiritual path, the spiritual path really is all about, fancy this, it's all about becoming aware of the diamond within. And the path of optimizing your spiritual enlightenment and self-realization, they call the diamond path. The diamond path. And the way they think about what you really are trying to allow to emerge in your psyche, or to become more conscious of the reality in your soul, is they have this goal of having you become aware of this indestructible diamond reality in your soul. As you might guess, this kind of got my attention, right? So I began to try to understand what they talk about this diamond path. And synchronistically, these people began to just, in the sessions with me, they would begin to just, I would ask them a question about it, and they would just begin to teach. And I was amazed, And so I just listened to them teach. And the thing that started happening was I began to have a lot of experience resonances with Christian understanding. I began to see, it sounds like these folks have been discovering a lot of the primal, fundamental spiritual reality that Christians have always talked about. And so, inevitably, I started to start thinking, looking at Scripture a little bit through their lens. It's often helpful, and some of you have probably been active in the Christian-Buddhist dialogue. I suspect some of you have. John Cobb, the great process theologian of Claremont, California, head of the Center for Process Studies. Cobb was this great Whiteheadian theologian, and who believed that the Christians and the Buddhists have a lot to teach each other. And that if they would bother to actually try to share insights, that both traditions would be enhanced and deepened. So I'm looking through this stuff that I'm not familiar with, and it occurs to me that it sounds like some biblical insights. And it sounds like some Christian mystical insights. And so as I think about that, I began to have some thoughts about ways to kind of rethink what actually might be set as a possible way of thinking about where we would like to go spiritually. I'm here tonight to simply say, I'm a little weird. I actually think you have these amazing potentials. And I'm here tonight to just say to you, it's been sort of made clear to me that we're shooting awfully low these days in terms of what's possible. You've heard people talk about settling in relationships. Seems to me that we settle a lot for, Ron was talking about this, about, how did you pronounce it? Accidia? Being a little spiritually lazy. So tonight I just want to lay out for you the things that have occurred to me that I might want to just lift up for us to think about tonight. In our version of trying to walk the diamond path to spiritual realization. So what is possible? Well, we could say, like some of the Native Americans, it's possible to learn to walk in the beauty way. That's one way to say it. It's possible to learn to walk in the beauty way. It's possible to move toward an elegant and radiant integration and coherence of psyche and spirit. That's really possible. It's not just a fantasy, an unrealistic pipe dream. And here's what the Tibetan Buddhists talk about a lot. And now listen to this now with your Christian ear. They talk about how primally close to you this radiant, abundant, big love of your inherent Buddha nature. I think that strikes what they think is, they think that the most real thing about you right now, without any effort, without any long training in meditation, without any radical asceticism, without any radical renunciation, they think right now, behind your ego consciousness, you are sitting in this radical, radiant compassion and love. They believe that in you, that I could look in your eyes and I can look right past your ego, and that in there, looking at me, is this what they call now get this now, what they call the radiant awareness being. There's this eternally powerful, loving, compassionate, radiant being that is pure awareness. What does that remind you of? So one thing that they teach is that it is not only realistic for you to think about dwelling in the primal abundance and the big love. Now get this now. Not only is it realistic for you to aspire to that, they think you're already there. Let me repeat that. They think that at your most fundamental reality, the most real thing about you is already radically enlightened being. Now, what does that remind you of in terms of Christian mystics? So think about that a bit. I have a poem. I forgot. I'm always forgetting things these days. But if I had been a little less forgetful, I would have invited all of you to invoke your most significant spiritual mentors, to invoke their spirits to be with us tonight. And I know every one of you has got key saints, present and past saints, that have helped you on your way. And I want you to think about and just name them in your hearts, the ones that have been the most bright and shining sources of illumination for you on your journey already. I wish we had time. I would have you all just stand and say their name. I'm going to be talking about a couple of my saints here tonight. One, I'm going to read you a poem of. And this is the great Sufi poet Rumi. If you have never heard Robert Bly and Coleman Barks offering the readings of Rumi poems together to music. That is an ecstatic thing. It's available. You should try to find those tapes. But here's Rumi, who obviously lived constantly conscious of the great friend. He called the great it the guest. The guest. Here's his poem called, and it's what we're talking about tonight, The Road Home. The Road Home. An ant hurries along a threshing floor with this little grain of wheat, moving between huge stacks, not knowing the abundance all around. It thinks its one grain is all there is to love. The ant and its one grain of wheat. So we choose a tiny seed to be devoted to. This body, one path, or one teacher. Look wider and further. The essence of every human being can see. And what that essence eye takes in, becomes Saturn or Solomon. The ocean pours through a jar, and you might say it swims inside the fish. The mystery gives peace to your longing and makes the road home, home. That is, he offers that primal insight a great deal of the time. It's a lot like what these Tibetan Buddhists teach. You're already swimming in the radiance. That's what Rumi believed. So anyway, so I began to give a lot of thought about that. And I was thinking about this in the light of this esoteric mystery that we've been thinking about, the mystery of the symbolism of the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of the indestructible vessel. As I was preparing this, I was thinking about Jung's essays on the transformation symbolism in the Mass. And it became quite clear to me as I was reflecting on this that every time you participate in the Mass, you're really acting out the kind of truth about the indwelling of the sacred in a transformative way all the time. So our path, what's our path? Spiritual path. It's learning to love the dragon, the great it, the great other within. We said last night, psychologically, it's understanding and living the ego archetypal self relationship. But spiritually, we could say it's actually learning to open to the love of the Great One. And according to these Tibetan Buddhists, we need to consider the possibility that we're already sitting in its radiance and love, and the big love they talk about now. We begin by acknowledging the reality that there is a great companion who understands. The hard part is actually beginning to open the conscious, respectful dialogue with the great it. I watched this for many years. when people were doing active imagination with the archetypal self. It's very fascinating. The great it will often manifest in the early time of someone's learning active imagination. It will often manifest sort of like a shy child. It will not trust you at first. It won't believe that you're really serious about being aware of it. But if you're trustworthy and you're doing active imagination, or if you're trustworthy and when you're getting those special delivery letters from the great it, then it's interesting, it starts to trust you more. And the amazing thing is it starts to actually speed up what it wants to tell you. Ron was so on target earlier today when he was talking about the sort of the God press, the God pressure coming in. It acts as if it is in a hurry to get caught up with you. It's like it's eager to get caught up with you. And so, our end of this is to just kind of wake up into more trustworthiness so that the great it starts to know that we respect it, that we're not going to take it for granted, that we're not going to cheapen it with a lack of seriousness. So there's a long period right there, and it takes different times for different people, that learning to build a relationship of trust. I used to talk, remember Brother Lawrence? I decided after witnessing this stuff for a long time that Brother Lawrence was always right. Talked about the centrality of practicing the presence. Practicing the presence. That's what the diamond path is about. Just getting to the point where you have a clear, committed intention to not go to sleep and to practice the presence all the time. People have interesting ideas about prayer. They often will think they should pray 20 minutes a day, or maybe even 45 minutes a day. But when you get into this territory, it's really not about saying rote prayers or saying them at a particular time. It is the cultivation of an ongoing, dependable awareness that you are not alone, and that you try to remember to be really suspicious when you start feeling like you're alone. Let me repeat that. It's a good thing to start learning to be suspicious when you feel alone. Because according to what Jung believes and what I have seen evidence for from all sorts of sources, you're really not ever alone. And the idea, the sense of being alone is really some kind of ego trickster phenomenon. In other words, if we're really feeling alone, we're back to Freud's idea that the ego is kind of a deceiver. Because there's never, this is what these Tibetans teach, And as I began to think back about Christian spirituality and the biblical insight, it's a biblical perspective. You're not ever alone. So we have to think, well, what's going on when we start going to the idea through the ego position of feeling alone all the time? So and I don't have time to talk about this now, I'm just going to lift them up. What I've been saying to you is there are all these ego psychologies. There are all these ego theologies. There are these ego spiritualities that seek to teach you and have you become expert, but often without learning to practice the presence. They're very intellectually sophisticated, all sorts of great theology and so on, but there's not any opening to the practicing the presence. Why would an ego want to not be aware of the great companion in the psyche? Think about that just a minute. Why would our ego want to go there? If it's not true, why would the ego go there? You can think about this in terms of what I've come to call the great refusal. The way in which our egos, at a lot of the time, seem to want to refuse awareness of the presence. That's a mystery. Ron was talking about mysteries. There's a mystery there. Why does the ego close up? Shut it out. Decide to walk alone, to be alone and lonely, and fantasize oneself being lonely in the psyche. Karl Barth, the great Protestant theologian, used to talk about what he called the mystery of iniquity. The mystery of iniquity. Why would anybody shut themselves off from a gracious God? He said that's a mystery. It's a psychological mystery. We talked about that last night. Why does the ego want to shut out the archetypal self? But even more centrally, in our spiritual life, why would we kind of sometimes prefer darkness? It's really weird. I was blessed, many years ago. You know how these faculties, one of your professors was telling me a while ago that, he got drafted to teach this course. And he stepped up. Well, many years ago, my graduate school turned to me, and it's weird, the psychoanalyst on the faculty, and they turn to me and they say, "We want you to teach the advanced courses in Paul Tillich." "Oh, yeah?" I said. "Oh, yeah." So that's what they wanted me to do. So I started to do that. I started to teach the advanced seminars in Tillich. One of the greatest things that ever happened to me. My wife, Margaret, used to be amused. I'd come home from teaching that seminar. Well, what was we doing in the seminar? We're just spending a lot of time with the mind of Paul Tillich, probably the greatest. I know he was the greatest Protestant theologian of the 20th century, and some Roman Catholic scholars think he's right there up there with in Catholic perspective in terms of insight. So I'd come home and I would have more energy than when I started. I was taught some things about Tillich when I was a really young guy. I discovered that all the things I had been taught really didn't seem to be the real Tillich at all. You may have even heard Tillich was considered to be a secularist, a rationalist, a rational reductionist who really wasn't religious at all. That's what the rap was. Turns out, you get into Tillich, as I was privileged to do, and it turns out he's a theologian of ecstasy. He believes, sort of like those Tibetan Buddhists, he believes you're sitting right now in the flow of the incredible fountain of being. You're sitting right now. In fact, you're actually, and to him, you're actually issuing out of the fountain of the power of being. And everything that is in you is pouring forth from this radiant being that he called the ground of being. So, turns out, Tillich was kind of a theologian of the Spirit with a capital S, a kind of a really, really interesting purveyor of Pentecost. Now I'm going to cut now to some of the things that have been kind of shown to me in the last probably a year, about 10 key steps on the diamond path. I'm just going to hit them lightly, and we can talk about them in our discussion later. First step, cutting through your denial, hitting bottom, recognizing your real situation, recognizing your longing, realizing what its true nature is, admitting the feeling of the lack, L-A-C-K, the lack, is dominating in your emotional life. This is the territory of the far country, the territory of the prodigal son. So you cut through denial first, and then you have to come to attention. That's number 2. You have to come to attention. And when he came to himself, awakening, acknowledging the great other, learning to really pay attention to the presence of the great other. And as Rumi says, turning to the road home. Turning to the road home. Number 3 step on this path. Developing right intention, meaning serious intention, not lukewarm intention. You could say, we'd say it today, we would say, you got to get all in. You got to get all in, both feet in. You got to eliminate your wobble. You got to get out of the middle. You got to leave the despair of indecision. You got to stop what Adler called the hesitating attitude. You got to get in with both feet. That's what commitment is. And the spiritual path, if you're serious about it, requires both feet. Both feet in it. Number 4, gaining some understanding. You might call it some wisdom, but gaining understanding about how these things work. I would say, following Jung and alchemy, there are 4 elements. And if you're going to create an inner temple, you're going to have to practice holding them in creative tension. That creative tension alone, that is the only thing that actually forms that cup I showed you on the diagram. It constructs the inner temple, the alchemical vessel, the holy grail within, the real chalice of the Eucharist, balancing the opposites, making possible the fifth element. And what's the fifth element? It's the capstone. And what's the capstone? It's practicing the presence consciously, continually. Number 5, you gotta stop being outside the gates. You gotta seek to enter what these Tibetan Buddhists call enter the radiance. You've got to get conscious in your mind that you're surrounded by this transformative energy field already. You don't have to create it. It's already there. You're welcome already to the banquet of abundance in your spiritual life. You're welcome already. In fact, at your deepest place, you're already there. To show your seriousness, you need to make offerings. We might say, you need to bring some of your fish and some of your bread to share with others in your banquet. You're getting very close now to being able to move to the place that you probably already dwell in reality, but you've got to learn how to dwell there consciously. Kind of realize you're already there. The word dwelling. If I had one word, or I would want 2 words to say the most important thing. The capacity to dwell. These Tibetan Buddhists say to abide. They say always, I take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma. That's the teaching. The scriptures. I take refuge in the Sangha. That's your community of faith. You take refuge there. The idea is to dwell there. David the king, Rod's been talking about, he taught that he sought to dwell in the house of the Lord all the time. It's become clear to me that dwelling in the house of the Lord is our parallel to taking refuge in the Buddha. So the state you can legitimately aspire to, see, you already dwell in the house of the Lord. See, you're already dwelling there, but you may not be awake to that reality. And your spiritual challenge is to stay awake and accept that all the time, if you can. So, opening to this fellowship of the dragon, who is it that are members of that real fellowship of the dragon? That's the people that are practicing the presence. In fact, who knows who that is? Only the great It. The only way one can come into a membership in that fellowship is through total authenticity. You cannot sneak your way into that. You cannot kind of lie your way into it. It's like the only way to gain entry into that is to really have that relationship with the big It. on an ongoing basis. That's who those who do that. Those are the ones that actually participate in that. And I'll say, who knows? Only the true God knows. But that may not be quite right if you think back about the experience of Jesus. Because before the disciples knew who Jesus was, the unhappy spirits knew. The unhappy spirits recognized who he was long before the disciples did. So I suspect the unhappy spirits, Jung called them spirit complexes, archetypal spirit complexes. They weren't personal complexes, but they exist in your psyche. He said those are what we used to call demons. And Tibetan Buddhists think that they're all around. And they call them hungry ghosts. Hungry ghosts. Or the hell beings. But their attitude toward them, and this is important for us as Christians, their attitude toward them is that they wish them blessing and healing and peace. And the great Bodhisattva, who is the Christ figure for these Buddhists, the great Bodhisattva of compassion, will never leave the realm of time as long as there's one suffering, hungry ghost, one being dwelling in hell. The great Bodhisattva of compassion will never go to nirvana as long as one being is suffering. Who does that sound like? Who does that sound like? Karl Barth believed that was Christ. And Karl Barth believed that the grace of God is so powerful that in spite of those who would love to believe that some of these folks are damned and go to hell forever, Karl Barth believed, no. Christ is going to keep at it until they get redeemed too. Sounds very much like these folks. All right, now I want to finish this up right quick, and then we can talk. A lot of us got the question now, is there any realistic hope for our suffering world, or should we just curl up in the snowbank of resignation and despair for a little nap? Think about that a minute, Let's just, we're kind of tired, we're fatigued, we're burned out, we got compassion fatigue. Maybe we should just kind of curl up in the snowbank, rest a little bit. Because it doesn't look like it's very hopeful. Jung was asked, is there any hope? He believed there was a slim reason for hope, just a slim one. He said, it's possible that there might be a vanguard of folks committed to relating consciously to the archetypal self, to the great it. And that if there were enough of those folks who really, authentically were doing what I say, loving the dragon, if there were enough people, we might say a remnant, who were actually loving the dragon, Jung thought that there might be some contagion that would break out of humility, and that it might spread like wildfire, and that it might turn the tide. He thought that's the only chance for us. He saw the gathering storm and knew at the end of the life that the prognosis, as we say, is guarded. But these Tibetan Buddhists, they believe there already exists that vanguard. They believe that there's already a vanguard of those who who dwell in the love of the great other with ecstasy. They are in ecstasy. They passionately and gradually seek to learn to dwell in the bliss and radiance of that awareness being. And they believe that that possibility of stepping in to satori or samadhi or liberation is always and everywhere forever represented to us as an existential possibility in every moment. Think about that. Who does that sound like? So there is this living Lord of the dance, who is that fundamental enlightened reality of the Most High, who is above every name. And according to these Tibetan Buddhists of the Dzogchen tradition, you know the ones who are enlightened because of the powerful compassion that flows constantly from their presence all the time. That's how you know enlightenment. It always rises simultaneously with compassion. So you gotta care for that fellowship, and I don't have time to talk about that right now. You gotta care for it. You gotta tend it. You gotta tend the garden of that. This is not a deistic point of view. You know, the watchmaker God that makes the watch and sets it on its own. It's not a theistic point of view. It's not a God that creates the world and still kind of keeps in touch by telegraph. This is a panentheistic God. And this panentheistic God, actually, like Tillich said, and like Alfred North Whitehead believed, it dwells constantly, present, powerfully in every puff of matter and being in all the universes. So what does Christianity have that the Buddhists sometimes struggle with? Well, the Buddhists think you really kind of want to see the world as an illusion. And the real idea is to kind of escape from the world of samsara. But Christians believe that the Christ event revealed that history on earth is the dwelling of the body and blood of God, and that you cannot set the goal of escaping from history and all its suffering. You got to recognize God in history and live the compassion in history. So anyway, if I had time, I would tell you about this really wild, radical Catholic death of God theologian, Thomas J.J. Altizer. He actually really believes that the transformation of history has already occurred, and that if we were fully awake, you would be living in the bliss of the radical presence of Christ. Sounds like those Buddhists to me. Sounds like those Buddhists. So I'm out of time here, but the diamond path that is really possible for us is to really wake up that you're living in the radiance now. You're living in the big love now. You're living in the powerful, indestructible compassion now. And when your ego's feeling lonely, you just got to try to keep your sense of humor. Because when your ego's feeling lonely, you have been tricked by the trickster ego. And you got to laugh so that you can be liberated from that spell. I'm going to stop right there. Let's take about 10 minutes and then come back, and I'm going to field questions for as long as Rose will let me. We better get started. I want to just invite you. You know, we've talked about a lot of things in the last 3 nights, and I know I've raised a lot more questions than I have provided any answers to. And there are lots of very, very great questions I'm sure you have. And so I just want to open it. Do we have our microphones? Yes. Rose is out there rounding up the doggies. All right, so say your name, sir, and
you were speaking of the diagram last night, the ego, the id, and the chalice.
Yeah.
And you mentioned a minute ago about the 5 loaves and fishes and maybe the Last Supper and the chalice. Could you kind of tie that together for me?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, you know, I started looking about the transformation symbolism in the Mass years and years ago when I was studying Jung's writings on this. Increasingly over the years, it's become clear to me that that the Eucharistic symbolism and ritual action is sort of an amazing ritualization of acting out of the truth about all this stuff. So that cup of blessing, you know, that image of that, you know, you can think it's the Holy Grail, the Grail cup, the chalice that the priest offers for the people in the Mass. If you look at all that stuff esoterically, it's all referring to the same reality. You know, I started out this thinking about the reason I got to thinking. You know, they had this movie came out about Noah, and it was I thought it was kind of synchronistic given the flood that we're in. And I began to kind of think a lot about the symbolism of the ark as a vessel and container. And it became clear to me that actually having a functioning vessel of transformation is one of the big keys. That's the big key. It's like Ron was talking about, is if you have all this God, and based on what I've been saying tonight, you're dwelling in the power of God all the time, see? And if you don't have that very, very indestructible vessel, then it can just make you real crazy. And a lot of people get fried in it, and they do become psychotic. They do become psychotic. Ron really gave a great summary about that. So I think that's what you're getting at. It's like, what can I say about that? It's just that all of the symbolism of all this stuff just sort of intersects in that chalice. If you got the chalice, it has to be an actual inner reality, though. You know, we got the cup out here, but that's a symbol of the need, the necessity for an inner cup of offering. See, so I suspect you know more about that than I do. I just, in my old age, I'm just really clear about how central that is. If you're going to dwell, these Tibetan Buddhists They just say, abide. They say, I abide. I abide. And you don't know who's talking, whether it's the human or whether it's the Buddha nature. But it is true. I abide. And what we're talking about tonight, abide consciously. You already abide. You don't have to try to create that by becoming an expert meditator. You just have to open to the reality that you are abiding now. And you probably have been abiding from before the foundations of the universe. But getting awake is hard. Yeah. Other questions, comments? Say your name, sir.
I'm going to throw you another hand grenade.
All right.
Only I'm going to pull the pin this time.
Just throw it at my head.
Okay. I'd like to ask a question of everyone in here first before I say what I'm going to say. How many people in here have read the Quran? Raise your hands.
Read what?
The Quran.
Quran.
Okay. Have you read the chapter?
Is this a pop quiz?
Yes, it is. Have you read the chapter on woman and the chapter on table? And is the Quran that you have read from a foreign country, or is it one printed in the United States? These are the things that I like to ask for the people who have read one. I suggest for everyone in here to pick up a Quran, read it, and understand it, one from a foreign country. And then my question is this: how do we...
You have a point, obviously.
Change, yes. How do we change the minds of Muslims to become Christians? Because if we don't, we're going to have problems. The chapter on woman and the chapter on table specifically says how to deal with a Christian or a Jew. And I think that everyone should be aware of this. And if we don't convert these people, we're going to be the ones who suffer. This is my opinion.
Well,
and so anyway,
we hear your opinion.
Okay, thank you.
We hear it.
But
and let me just say that there's this principle in Bowen systems theory that applies in this situation. If you want somebody else to get less full of hate and be less chaotic and less aggressive, the most powerful thing you can do is to go into peace yourself. And if you're too anxious about that, that is something to be worked on. Because Jesus said, be not anxious. Be not anxious. And I know when all of the forces are invading Iraq and Baghdad as we speak, I know that that's a big source of anxiety. But I don't want to go down that path tonight. Yes?
Hi. This is not formulated very well, but...
Take your time.
This is where I'm going. If we, in the spirit of individualism that we have in today's society, the U.S., we really emphasize about going within, which I agree is so very important. Would people find themselves more into their own relationship, God and me, rather than the community of going to church on Sunday in that community? That was one question I had within my head. If we really emphasized one more than the other or something. And the other, I thought, we go in front of the Eucharist as Catholics for adoration, and we kind of project the presence of God there.
Right.
And then we say, no, God is here. And I'm wondering if we have a disconnect somehow.
A disconnect?
a disconnect when we say, God's presence is there. No, God is here.
Well, we all got a disconnect, don't we? But see, we're always projecting God, and it's an idealizing projection, and it's what we call in psychoanalysis an idealizing transference. So we put our sense of the gold or the divine out here, but there's nothing, that's what we humans do. I've written before that if you're going to discover the gold inside your heart, you're very likely going to have to project it on somebody out here and let them carry it for a while until there's this arcing, this flow of energy that goes between, I see you as the gold, I see you as the Holy One, I see you as the one that's the bearer of the divine child. And then gradually, because you let me relate to you, and you let me put you on a pedestal, then there can be a kind of an energy arc. And gradually I might start to wake up to the gold that's in my heart. See? And so that's an eternal flow there. In this world, what we know now from quantum mechanics, you can't be disconnected. It's impossible at the most fundamental level to be disconnected. We all dwell in this radiant energy field, and a lot of the most recent unpublished scientific research is talking something really weird. It's really kind of wild, because there's more and more evidence that not only is matter conscious, but energy is conscious. And you are not separate. You're not disconnected. You're in the flow. So, our ego is going to tell us that we're disconnected. Keep a sense of humor. All the evidence now says you're in the flow. You're not disconnected. And that trickster ego may kind of want you to feel disconnected and be anxious, but it's not true. So anyway, I know I have a sense of how confusing a lot of this stuff is, and I want to have time to ask Ron about all this. That was a magnificent lecture this morning. I mean, he answered all kinds of questions that I didn't even have. Who else has got a question they want to put on the table? Yes. What?
I kind of wanted to ask a question about something you had mentioned about the indestructible diamond core or center.
Yeah.
Resting behind our ego that may sometimes be our flawed ego.
Always.
Always. Right. What is it that limits us from going through that flawed ego? And can you expound on that just a bit? Is it limitations of past trauma? Is it limitations of grandiosity? Thank you.
All of the above. All of the above. It's a multidimensional mystery. Mystery of iniquity. Why do we dwell in the health space of horrible anxiety? I've realized recently, it's kind of shameful for me to say that, but I've realized fairly recently how much of my life I spent in horrific anxiety. Horrific anxiety. And, how, hold a gun at my head and say, explain why that was. You just have to shoot me. I couldn't explain that to you, but I know it's been true. It is a mystery, see, but it isn't the final mystery. So, you could probably, if you just sit down and relax and think about it, you could probably give us a lecture about that and why, I suspect. Let's see. What do we got? 2 or 3 minutes?
Okay.
Lupe, okay.
Hello. And I was wondering if you could share steps 7 through 10 in the Diamond Path.
When you invite me back, I'll go through those in more detail. I'm sorry that went so fast because Rose was waving at me, And I didn't want her to get her hook. And yank me off the stage. And but I don't really have time tonight, but I can just say that it's quite clear that there is it's like that diagram, that 7-stage diagram. You got to wake up to the presence of the great other first. Because if you're asleep and in the far country, you got to come to before you can go home. And so it's that whole stepping from realizing that you got to wake up. It's a long way home. What are the chances I'm going to get there? Well, if you're too kind of loosey-goosey, they're not good. And so there's one thing I didn't get a chance to talk about, but it's fierceness. Fierceness. Holy fierceness. Holy fierceness. Because if this walk in this diamond path, if that's important, and it's eternally important, then it deserves both feet in it. Past the wobble, fierce commitment to your creative unfolding of your selfhood and your capacity to dwell. A lot of folks think that there's this, that love never goes with power. But that is a lie. Because our calling is to stand clearly in the big love, which is this indestructible, powerful compassion. It is not weak. And, folks that kind of they think about Jesus as the victim. I don't think they get it about what his work was. What was his work? Well, it wasn't about being masochistic and being a victim. It was an act of primordial liberation of history. And I don't have time to get into that now, but I have had a good time, and I just got to mention, I've had a good time studying the latest work of Thomas J.J. Altizer, who I was told when I was young was a sort of a terrible atheistic, a death of God person. Turns out that nothing could be further from the truth. He was a radical, he is, I think he's still alive, he is a radical Catholic. And what we've been talking about, who is radical about realized eschatology. The eschaton, the second coming, has already happened. And the world, just like you sit in the power and the radiant power of being, history has already been redeemed. What's going on? Well, there's a lot of unhappy spirits that are fomenting a lot of chaos in the world, in my personality, in the world, in all sorts of forms. Jung talked about them as spirit complexes, positive spirit complexes, angels. Negative spirit complexes, we used to call them demons. Buddhists call them hungry ghosts or hell beings. And you could just think about it a little bit this way. There are a lot of nervous hell beings now. You can tell. You can tell that there are a lot of really, really nervous, anxious spirit complexes. You got a flood of anxiety around. Who's anxious and why would they be anxious? Well, you put your Christian hat on, think a little bit about realized eschatology. And if Thomas J.J. Altizer is right, these unhappy spirits, these hungry ghosts, they're trying to maintain their denial. Think about that now a minute. They're seeking to maintain not knowing that something has changed. Now, at your deepest heart of hearts, you know something has changed. Think about that. You know something has changed. The Lord of history is with us now, already in power. In power. And so, it's not time to be in despair. I have no despair whatsoever. I have no despair. If you, deep down in you, you don't either. In your deeper parts of your soul, you're not in despair. Got to think about that a little bit. One more question or comment back here. Go ahead.
One more question. And my question is, which of the inner selves is the one that's commonly referred to as the shadow self?
Okay. This will be, understanding the structure of the shadow would be one of my lectures when I come back. It's a really interesting question because the truth is the shadow is your shadow depends on how you have incarnated the different archetypal energies, the particular configuration. If you look in that booklet I gave you, I have delineated 16 configurations of archetypal energies for males and 16 configurations for women. And your shadow depends on what you left out when you were building your Mayan pyramid. And all of us in here, I mean, you're talking about your inner Mayan pyramid, you know, the sacred mountain, what the Buddhists call Mount Meru. They think that your spine is Mount Meru, center of the universe. And we all have to build that. You got to build that vessel. It doesn't come with a territory. You got to build it block by block. And see, you can't start everywhere. You know, you started building your temple from one side of those archetypal systems, and I probably started from another. We want to all get to the same place. We want to be able to get, have you ever been to Chichen Itza? How many have been to Chichen Itza? You know that temple up on top of that pyramid? That's, in my view, that's the best symbol there is about where the human meets the divine and sits down in a colloquy. Right up there in that temple on top of that. So that's a long discussion. But if I had a little time with you, we could figure out fairly quick how your shadow would be shaped. And remember, the shadow is not all negative. In fact, a lot of us, we we didn't get blessed very much. You know, Ron's brilliant, talking about the need for blessing. And whatever good thing about you didn't get blessed, it splits off into the unconscious. And that's your shadow. So your shadow may be all kinds of wonderful things that your family just refused to see in you. See? So that's there's a lot of lectures available on that. So that's our last question. I wish there was time for more. I want to thank you again for this opportunity to be with you. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it very much. Thank you. Thank you.
This concludes The Real Ark, Building the Fellowship of the Golden Dragon, the third of 3 related lectures by Dr. Moore presented at the conference, Coping with Grandiosity in Our Lives, the Deity and the Dragon Inside Us. Recorded at the Oblate School of Theology's 2014 Summer Institute in San Antonio, Texas. This program is published by IS Publications. All content copyrighted 2014 by Dr. Robert Moore. All rights reserved. This recording is copyright 2014 by IS Publications. All reproduction, distribution, and performance rights reserved.